At the peak of his global rise, when A$AP Rocky, Rakim Athelstan Meyers, the Harlem-born force reshaping music, fashion, and culture, seemed untouchable, life reportedly took a sudden and devastating turn that no spotlight or success could prepare him for. Sources close to his world describe a moment that stopped everything in its tracks, a cancer diagnosis that shattered the illusion of invincibility he had carried through years of chaos, controversy, and creative domination. Not the Swedish detention that once made international headlines in 2019, not the courtroom pressure, not even the public storms surrounding his name or the painful losses within the A$AP mob. This was different. This was personal, silent, and unforgiving. According to those accounts, Rocky faced the reality head-on, choosing every available medical path with the same intensity he brought to his career: radiation, surgery, and the brutal discipline of treatment that leaves no room for ego or image. The same artist known for turning aesthetics into power and pain into sound was now forced into a battle where none of that mattered. In rare reflections attributed to him during this period, he is described as carrying both vulnerability and defiance at once, the kind of emotional contradiction that strips away celebrity and reveals the person underneath. "I will beat this," he reportedly said with unwavering conviction, not as a slogan, but as a decision, as if surrender was never part of his vocabulary. Yet behind that strength was honesty, an admission that the diagnosis didn't just interrupt his life, it cracked it open. Early detection reportedly gave hope, but not comfort. The words "not spread" and "treatable" may define medical outcomes, but they do not erase the fear, exhaustion, or physical toll that comes with being pulled into a fight against one's own body. Sources describe a man who, for the first time in years of relentless motion, touring, creating, building, surviving, was forced to stop completely and confront fragility in its rawest form. He was not performing resilience, he was living through it. And in that stillness, music remained his only refuge. The same space that once carried his grief, his losses, his legal battles, and his rise to global influence became the emotional ground where this new reality could even be processed. For Rocky, sound was never just art, it was translation, a way to turn chaos into something survivable. Now, it became the only language that could hold what words could not fully explain. At the same time, there is a growing sense that this experience reshaped his perspective beyond himself. Those close to him suggest he began thinking less about the next drop, the next collaboration, the next wave of fame, and more about legacy, impact, and using his platform for something far more urgent than entertainment. What emerges from this chapter is not just a story of illness, but a story of confrontation, between identity and mortality, between image and reality, between a life built in motion and a moment that demanded stillness. This is the origin story of Rakim Athelstan Meyers, the transformation from a Harlem-born child into the global phenomenon known as A$AP Rocky, and the hidden cost behind a life that was never built for normalcy. Born on October 3, 1988, in Harlem, New York City, Rakim entered a world that carried both historical weight and modern struggle, an environment forever marked by its cultural legacy and its ongoing battles with inequality, displacement, and survival. Harlem itself is not just a location, it is a symbol etched into American cultural history. Once the heart of the Harlem Renaissance, it gave rise to a generation of black artists, poets, musicians, and thinkers who reshaped global culture and redefined identity through creativity. But the Harlem Rakim was born into decades later was no longer in its celebrated golden age. It was a neighborhood still rich in spirit and expression, but also deeply affected by economic neglect, systemic inequality, and the long aftermath of the crack epidemic that had torn through communities in the 1980s and beyond. Rakim's identity was shaped in the middle of that contrast. His father, Adrian Meyers, brought Barbadian roots into the family line, adding a Caribbean cultural layer that would later influence Rakim's global outlook and artistic versatility. His mother, Renee Black, became the emotional anchor of his early life, holding the family together through instability, uncertainty, and financial pressure. Like many families in New York's hardest-hit communities, survival often required adaptation, resilience, and an unspoken understanding that stability was never guaranteed. At different points in his upbringing, Rakim experienced hardship that forced him to mature early. He has spoken about periods where housing insecurity and financial struggle were part of daily reality, conditions that existed in stark contrast to the wealth that surrounded the same city blocks. His father's incarceration during his childhood created an emotional absence that would echo through his formative years, shaping how he understood trust, presence, and independence. Later, the loss of his father during his teenage years deepened that void, leaving behind a silence that would subtly influence both his personality and his artistry. Even as a child, Rakim gravitated toward music, not as entertainment, but as expression. By the age of 12, he was already treating rap as a serious craft, studying rhythm, language, and delivery with unusual focus. For him, music became more than sound, it became a method of survival, a way to process a world that often felt unstable and unforgiving. As he grew older, another form of expression began to emerge alongside it: fashion. What started as curiosity evolved into a sharp creative instinct, allowing him to see clothing not just as style, but as identity, storytelling, and cultural language. That dual vision, music and aesthetics, would eventually define his rise. The formation of ASAP Mob in Harlem marked a turning point, not simply as the creation of a collective, but as the beginning of a movement built on ambition, identity, and reinvention. It was here that Rakim Athelstan Meyers began the transformation into A$AP Rocky, a figure who would later stand at the intersection of hip-hop, fashion, and global influence. But even this origin story now sits in a larger shadow. Because when viewed in the context of his reported health battle, everything changes tone. The rise, the struggle, the success, and the survival all feel part of a much longer narrative, one where every victory was earned against pressure most people never see, and where even success could not guarantee permanence or protection. A$AP Rocky's evolution into a cultural force was never accidental, it was engineered from the very beginning as a complete artistic vision, where music, fashion, visual identity, and attitude were not separate disciplines, but different expressions of the same. Creative language. From its earliest formation in late 2000s Harlem, ASAP Mob was built as more than a rap collective. It was a cultural system, one that treated style, sound, and image as equally important tools for shaping influence in a world where attention had become the most valuable currency. The group emerged from a generation of young Harlem artists who were deeply rooted in New York's hip-hop DNA but refused to stay confined by it. Their inspirations were global: the textures of European high fashion, the raw energy of Japanese streetwear, the experimental edge of underground art photography, and the evolving language of internet-era aesthetics. This was not traditional hip-hop identity building, it was something more layered, more intentional, and more visually driven. And at the center of it stood A$AP Rocky, whose presence quickly became impossible to ignore. From the earliest days, Rocky wasn't just a member of the collective, he was its focal point. His natural charisma, combined with a rare understanding of both sound and visual presentation, positioned him as the face of a movement that was still forming its identity. When his early work began circulating, especially the breakout 2011 mixtapes, something shifted in hip-hop's creative landscape. Deep Purple introduced his experimental tone, but it was live love ASAP that truly changed perception. It didn't feel like a standard mixtape, it felt like a fully realized aesthetic experience, blending Houston's chopped and screwed influence with New York grit, while layering it with atmospheric production and a cinematic sense of mood. The internet responded instantly. The project spread rapidly, not through marketing machinery, but through organic cultural recognition. Critics and listeners alike began describing Rocky not just as a rapper, but as a fully formed artist with a distinct worldview. The industry took notice quickly. A major label deal followed, reportedly around $3 million with RCA Records, signed before he even released a debut studio album. In industry terms, he wasn't being introduced anymore, he was being positioned as a priority, a centerpiece of the next generation. But behind this rise was another force that shaped the collective's identity in a deeper way: ASAP Yams. Steven Rodriguez, known as Yams, was the strategic and creative architect behind much of ASAP Mob's early direction. He wasn't just a member, he was the thinker, the connector, the one who understood the long-term vision before anyone else fully saw it. His approach helped define the group's aesthetic DNA and its positioning in both music and fashion culture. When Yams died in 2015 at just 26 years old due to acute mixed drug intoxication, it didn't just shock the collective, it destabilized it emotionally and structurally. For Rocky, the loss carried a weight that went far beyond friendship. Yams had been a co-creator, a cultural mirror, and a foundational voice in shaping the entire ASAP identity. Losing him meant losing the person who understood the vision most completely. The grief that followed became embedded not only in Rocky's personal life but in the tone of his work, his interviews, and his artistic direction. What followed was a shift in energy. Long Live ASAP became more than an album title, it became a statement of survival, released in early 2013 and debuting at #1 on the Billboard 200. It marked Rocky's arrival as a mainstream force, but it also carried the early signs of emotional complexity beneath the success. then came at long last. ASAP in 2015, released shortly after Yam's passing, where the weight of loss became more visible in the music itself. By the time testing arrived in 2018, Rocky had fully embraced artistic experimentation, even at the cost of public certainty about direction or genre. Yet through every phase of his musical evolution, another identity was rising in parallel, one that would eventually become just as influential: fashion. Rocky was not simply wearing clothes, he was constructing visual language. His aesthetic choices drew from Raf Simons, Dior, Japanese street culture, and vintage American sportswear, but the combination was uniquely his own. He didn't follow fashion cycles, he influenced them. Designers, editors, and brands began responding to his presence as if he were part of the industry itself, not just a collaborator within it. Over time, A$AP Rocky became something rare in modern culture, an artist whose influence cannot be separated into categories. Over time, A$AP Rocky became something rare in modern culture, an artist whose influence cannot be separated into categories. He is not just music, not just fashion, not just celebrity, but a convergence of all three, shaped by loss, ambition, and constant reinvention. And now, when viewed in the context of his reported health battle, his story takes on an even more fragile meaning. Because everything that once felt like momentum, career, identity, legacy, now exists inside a human reality where none of it is guaranteed, and even the most carefully built worlds can be interrupted without warning. A$AP Rocky was never simply a rapper with a strong sense of style, he was someone for whom visual identity functioned as seriously as music itself, as if both were chapters of the same creative language. Over time, that philosophy expanded far beyond hip-hop, turning him into a figure who moved comfortably between industries that rarely overlap. His role as creative director for Puma signaled that shift clearly, but it didn't stop there. Collaborations with Guess, Under Armour, Dior, and J.W. Anderson reflected something deeper than celebrity endorsement. These were not branding deals in the traditional sense, they were invitations for creative input, recognition of a perspective that influenced design rather than just promoting it. In the fashion world, Rocky began to appear less like a guest and more like a participant in the system itself. His presence on the covers of publications such as GQ, Dazed, and ID reinforced that transformation. Each appearance carried a different energy, sometimes conceptual, sometimes raw, sometimes experimental, but always intentional. He approached fashion the way a visual artist approaches a canvas, treating clothing, posture, lighting, and styling as interconnected elements of a single idea. What emerged was a public image built not on spontaneity, but on control, a carefully constructed aesthetic identity where nothing felt accidental. This expanded creative role gave him access to spaces far beyond hip-hop. Suddenly, Rocky was part of conversations happening in European luxury fashion houses, Japanese streetwear circles, and global creative studios where photographers, stylists, and art directors shaped visual culture at scale. He was no longer operating inside one industry, he was moving across multiple creative ecosystems at once. And in doing so, he became something increasingly rare in modern entertainment, a figure whose influence was not limited to sound or performance, but extended into how culture itself is visually designed and perceived. But that level of visibility also intensified the image he carried. A$AP Rocky became synonymous with curation, every outfit, every appearance, every visual moment read as part of a larger aesthetic statement. He wasn't just presenting himself, he was constructing a continuous creative narrative where music and fashion were two expressions of the same identity. Being A$AP Rocky was no longer a stage name, it functioned as a full-time artistic framework. That carefully controlled public world was disrupted dramatically in June 2019, when Rocky was detained in Stockholm, Sweden, following a street altercation that he later described as an act of self-defense. According to his account, the situation began when he and his entourage were repeatedly followed and harassed by two individuals, escalating into a confrontation that ultimately turned physical. What might have remained a localized incident quickly transformed into an international legal case with global attention. Rocky's detention in a Swedish correctional facility lasted several weeks, during which prosecutors reviewed the circumstances of the incident. Reports about his confinement, describing restricted conditions, limited comfort, and legal frustration, sparked growing concern among fans, family members, and public figures. the situation escalated far beyond the boundaries of entertainment news and entered the realm of international diplomatic discussion. In a highly unusual turn of events, even then, U.S. President Donald Trump became involved, making direct calls to Swedish Prime Minister Stefan Löfven urging resolution of the case. The involvement of a sitting U.S. president in the legal matter of a musician underscored just how far the situation had escalated beyond expectation. What began as a street confrontation had turned into a global headline involving politics, justice systems, and public perception on an international scale. As media coverage intensified, the case became more than just about one artist. It evolved into a wider conversation about legal fairness, racial profiling, and the treatment of black men within justice systems across different countries. Public debate split across multiple narratives, some focused on the legal specifics of the incident, while others viewed it through a broader cultural and social lens. By the time the situation resolved and Rocky was released, the episode had already left a lasting mark on his public narrative. It reinforced a recurring theme in his life story, that his career, no matter how glamorous or globally celebrated, has repeatedly intersected with moments of disruption, conflict, and vulnerability, each one reshaping the way the world sees him, and perhaps the way he sees himself. Stay connected because this story is far from over. From Harlem streets to global stages, ASAP Rocky's journey is built on pain, power, and survival. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. More shocking updates and untold celebrity truths are coming next. Stay tuned and don't miss what happens next.